Today is one of Unity 5 Cities co-founders, a licensed Unity teacher, and somebody who incorporates Unity teachings into her life. And I always appreciate that. It's Therese Solimeno.
Thank you, Brian. You know, I'm asked often, how do I come up with the themes for my talks? And usually something just pops into my head. And what popped into my head this time was a scene from a movie. And, you know, no surprise, because you guys know what a movie buff I am. But it was a scene from a movie called The Miracle Worker. And The Miracle Worker was a movie made out of a play that was produced in the late 50s, and the movie was made in the early 60s, and it was about when Annie Sullivan met Helen Keller. And I have to admit that at the time when I was a kid, my real interest in watching this movie wasn't really about that story. There were two things. One was that my mother was the spitting image of Anne Bancroft, who played Annie Sullivan in the play, in the movie. And I mean, it was amazing. They were born within 3 months of each other. My mother's first name was Anne, her name was Anne. I mean, you know, sometimes people would stop my mother on the street and tell her, you know, how much she looked like her. So I needed to see what Anne Bancroft looked like, because I didn't know who that was at the time. And the other reason was that Patty Duke, who played Helen Keller, had a TV show where she played an American teenager who had an identical twin British cousin. And I was a twin. And my sister and I used to watch that show for tips on how to, but we weren't identical, so it never really worked. So anyway, from superficial reasoning, I watched this movie. And it was, okay, who has seen The Miracle Worker? If you haven't seen it recently or at all, you have to see this movie. It is amazing. The performances are amazing, and Bancroft won an Academy Award. I think Patty Duke got a special Academy Award. It is, it's the story of, so you all know, right? Helen Keller was born with normal senses, and at the age of 19 months, she contracted this unknown disease, although later on they think it might have been meningitis or something. And she lost her sight and her hearing. And from 19 months until the age of almost 7, she muddled through with her own awkward way of trying to communicate with her family. But clearly that wasn't, you know, that wasn't very effective until her family was suggested by a friend, contact this school that was founded by Alexander Graham Bell that specialized in teaching for the deaf. And Annie Sullivan came to their home and started working with Helen Keller. Now imagine this, you're not quite 7, and someone you don't know starts doing these finger movements in your hand, and you have no idea what that means. It would be like, you know, someone starting to tap out Morse code on your shoulder. And it's like, what is this person poking me in the shoulder? What does this mean? Well, this is how she related to these finger movements. But after about a month, as the story goes, they were at the water pump, and she's spelling the word water in Helen's hand, and all of a sudden Helen made the connection that these letters, these symbols that she was forming in her hand were letters that made a word, and WATER meant water. And it was a breakthrough for her then to have a connection to the world. Now Helen Keller, that was when she was 7. She went on to go to the school. She went on to graduate Harvard's Radcliffe College with summa cum laude. She went on to be a lecturer and an author and a speaker. And, you know, I mean, her life was amazing after that. And I thought, well, what is it about a 7-year-old kid in 1887 and whatever happened to her? How is that relevant to giving a talk today. And, you know, I confess, as a new thought teacher, student, I ask myself these questions about a lot of stuff because on the surface value, you know, there's always going to be meaning underneath. And so I want to backtrack and just acknowledge that in unity, we talk about having to have a direct connection with spirit, that we don't need, we really don't need anything on the outside, that we have a Christ spirit within us. And if we tap into that through meditation and prayer and reflection, that we really don't need anything else. We don't need books, we don't need videos, we don't need anything in the way. It was a key message in the Bible. That's the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? Jesus came, you know, created the New Testament because he had a different way of relating to God. God to him was not this, you know, vengeful, erratic dictator that had chronic PMS. You know, that's the God of the Old Testament. All right. So now the God, Jesus's God, he related to as my Father, the Father, a benevolent being, right? So, and he would say things that would allude to that. You know, these things I do, you can do even greater, because we go to the Father, directly to the Father, that spiritual connection within us. And, you know, physician, heal thyself. And if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you with, or, you know, well, okay, maybe that wasn't Jesus. You know, some of these platitudes that you hear. So that change the perspective of how we relate. You don't need Pharisees, you don't need priests, you know. And then the founder of Unity, Charles Fillmore, did the same thing, right? Before he founded Unity, he and his wife had study groups, and they studied all kinds of religions. He was a seeker in the truest sense of the word. And he studied all this stuff, and he'd say, you know, I'll paraphrase, basically, you know, in this Babel, I should be able to go straight to headquarters, or it's all a sham. And that's what he did every night, 4 o'clock in the morning. He'd get up and he'd meditate for hours, and he felt like he had this relationship directly with God. And that is absolutely 100% true, that we can have a direct relationship with God to, you know, to heal our lives, except when it's not. Because there are times when we think we've got the answers, when we think we've got it all worked out. But what we've really done is we are deaf and we are blind to our own struggles. And we need somebody on the outside to help us work it out. One example of that, again, comes from the Fillmores, where Myrtle Fillmore, also a truth student, you know, very well versed in all of this stuff, went to a lecture and heard a speaker say, I am a child of God and I do not inherit illness. Now, Myrtle had been afflicted with tuberculosis her whole life. She's now 40. And it's the first time she heard something that went, you mean I'm not at fault for this? I can do something about this? And so she went home and meditated and said affirmations. I'm a child of God. I do not inherit illness. And after a while, and I'm not really clear how long, but after a while, she was cured of tuberculosis. And then I look at the founders of AA, 12-step programs, but specifically Dr. Bob Smith and Bill Wilson. They were desperate alcoholics, tried everything to become sober. In those days, in the early 20th century, the idea of alcoholism was looked at as a moral failing. And they heard that maybe it isn't, maybe it's physical, whatever, but they tried everything individually to cure themselves or get straight or get sober, and it didn't work until they came together and they had a conversation that Dr. Bob said, I'll give you 15 minutes because he'd heard it all. Didn't want to hear anymore. I'll give you 15 minutes. And that conversation turned out to be a 6-hour conversation. And from it, in 1934, they established Alcoholics Anonymous. And one of the tenets of that is not just to surrender that you're powerless over alcohol, but that you have to talk to another alcoholic. You need someone else. And so there are times in our lives when we need someone else. And not only do we need someone else, but we need to say, yes, we can hear these things, but we need to somehow find something. The miracle is in the ability to hear it and to say, you know what? I think I need to act on this. It's been interesting for me. You know, we don't know where these messages are going to come from. We don't know where these miracles are going to come from. I submit that the miracle worker in this story isn't necessarily Annie Sullivan, although certainly what she did for Helen Keller was quite a miracle. But the miracle workers were her parents who heard about this school, who sent off for a teacher, who said, I'm not going to settle for my child, my 6-year-old child, stumbling through her life with this fake communication strategy that she had. I want something better. I'm going to say yes to the suggestion of contacting someone else for help. That's the miracle. The miracle is when you can hear something or sense something and then act on it. So that's my message for today is, yes, of course, we always have the ability to contact spirit, mind, whatever you want to call it, within us. But acknowledge that there are times when reaching out to someone else, some other person, some other thought, some other entity, some book, some video, all the things I had said earlier that we don't always need, will help you at least get to that point of something inside me said to fill in the blank. And it's remarkable, you know, I think about times in my life where I've had those aha moments that came from nowhere, you know, and I want to share those because they're pretty significant. You know, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes about 15 or so years ago. And what I had always heard about diabetes was that it was progressive, it wasn't curable, and that, you know, you had to be careful because as you got older, it got worse. And, you know, and so the common wisdom at the time, and this is the ADA, and was, you know, here are these diets and, you know, you eat restrictively, but it wasn't, you know, when I look at what the diet suggested were, you know, I think, oh my God, how in the world could anybody survive that? But I got an email. I got an email from Blue Shield, my insurance company, and it said, there is a program that helps you reverse diabetes. And I thought, yeah, and I'm sure it's going to make me thin and beautiful and blonde too. But you know, I never believed stuff like that. But I thought, well, reverse diabetes, that's an interesting term. So I looked into it. And basically it said, cut your carbs and your sugar. And I thought, okay, I can do that. So I tried it. And not only did I reverse my diabetes, or at least my numbers have been reversed for over a year, I also magically lost 20 pounds. So, but I said yes to that email. I said yes to that program. I said yes to something that was completely different from what I had tried up until that point. Conversely, there was about 15, 16 years ago, we have a house in San Luis that we were renting out, and I put an ad in Craigslist for a renter. And a woman from LA contacted me, and she said, I need a place. I only need it for like 3 months, but I need to get out of LA. I need to get out of my situation. And I said, okay, you know, I kind of have this sense about, yeah, it would be nice to rent it for a year, but something in her voice and her stories said, yeah, okay, sure, 3 months, I can deal with that. And she came up and we met and we talked for a long time. She was a woman about my age. She was going through transition in her life. And I said, well, while you're here, there is this array of books on my shelf, all these New Thought books, all these Unity books, all these self-help books that I had studied while I was getting my license, my teaching license. And he said, you know, you might want to read some of them. And we would talk and she would call me and we would chat and everything. And, you know, we kind of stayed in touch and kind of didn't, mostly through Facebook. But that was the extent of, you know, the last I had heard from her like 15, 16 years ago. And then about a month ago, I got a voicemail and it was from her. And she said, I'm just sitting here thinking about what you did for me and how much my life changed from staying at your house, reading your books, talking to you. You know, we don't know the effects that we have on the people around us and the things that they take from our interaction. Just one comment, one word, and we can have an effect on the people around us. So, so that's what the relationship between a 6 or 7-year-old girl in 1887 has in 2023. Again, I encourage you to watch this movie. It's funny, it's dramatic, it's amazing. But when we look deeper and we look at all the things that conspired to improve her life, and there's stuff that we can take from that for today. Now, I wanted to close, you know, like I said, I'm a big TV fan, a movie fan, and one of my favorite TV shows was a show called The West Wing. And I want to close with a parable from The West Wing, because it kind of talks about this sort of thing. And the premise of it was, for those of you who didn't watch The West Wing, there was a senior advisor to the president who was shot in a failed assassination attempt on the president, but he was shot instead. And very serious injury, and it's maybe 6-8 months later, and he thinks he's fine. But certain things are starting to eat at him, and he's starting to lash out, and he's starting to react poorly at work, and yells at the president during one meeting. And so next thing you know, he's having a meeting with a trauma specialist. Basically, he turns out he's got PTSD. And his boss, who has had some issues of his own in the past, comes to see him afterwards. And Josh, the guy who had the therapy, said to him, "How did you know?" And this is the parable that he was told. So a guy walks down the street and he falls into a hole. And he's looking at this hole and it's too deep to climb out of. And he says, you know, how do I get out of here? And he starts looking for help. And a priest walks by and he says, "Father, can you help me? I need some help." And the priest did the sign of the cross and walks off. So then the doctor walks by and he says, "Doc, can you help me? I'm down in this hole." And the doctor writes him out a prescription, throws it down into the hole, and he walks away. And then a friend walks by, and and he says, "Friend, can you help me? I'm down in this hole." And the friend jumps in the hole. And the guy says, "Are you crazy? Now both of us are down here." And the friend says, "Yeah, but I've been down here before and I know the way out." And that's how you get out of the hole, is to rely on a friend. And so that's my message for you today, is that sometimes you can do it on your own, and sometimes you just need a friend. Thank you very much.